I am Giulia Bottaro and I'm joined today by Heather Dinwoody and Felicia Jackson. Today, as ever, we're going to talk about 3 stories that caught our eye from the past few days. And we can just swiftly start with Felicia.
So the story I've picked this week is a research story, but it does feed into wider changes in the market. Basically, this is the results of a 5-year analysis done by Break Free from Plastic. And what it actually found in a research paper that was published, I think it was last week, that 56 companies are responsible for about half of all global plastic and plastic waste. It also found that every 1% increase in consumer goods companies' plastic production, so that's plastic bottles and plastic packaging and food packaging and all that kind of stuff, that is literally a 1-to-1 growth in plastic pollution. And that means those terrible pictures you see of, plastic bottles and plastic forks and sitting in rivers in Africa and Asia. And I think this is particularly important when we think that last week we were talking about in the section on myths, we were talking about the fact that, 80% of the world's emissions come from about 100 companies. That's been debunked slightly because of specifics around, well, what sort of emissions are you talking about and where is it working and how is it working? But this actually breaks it down by some of these FMCG companies. It actually says that Coca-Cola was responsible for 11% of branded waste. That's insane globally.
Interesting then, because I was going to ask sort of when it's talking about these companies, is it on the production side or the demand side? It sounds like it's the demands, if they're measuring by waste. Then...
So they're measuring by waste, but this is what's particularly interesting about the fact that at the moment there's a meeting going on about the Global Plastics Treaty, because one of the things that's actually come up in conversations is this target of reducing the production of plastics by 40%. I think it's by 2040 from a 2025 base. But the point that I was sort of going for on this is about systemic problems. We talked before about this idea that people are made to feel responsible for the choices they make. But if the largest companies in the world are all producing things in a certain way, covering them in plastic and then delivering them to us, what choice do we have about doing things differently? So this idea that we really have to take note and take action on the pollution that plastics is causing is really getting to, it's becoming this really mainstream conversation. All the countries in the world are seriously discussing putting in place a treaty that reflects the same sort of ambition as the climate treaty, to get every country in the world to come together and take action to keep the environment clean. And I think it works on multiple levels here, because I always worry about plastics because they're derived from oil. So obviously there's a huge demand for fossil fuels that comes from that, but they don't break down in the environment. So we use them and they get thrown away. The 3 areas that are seen to be the most problematic and the ones that produce the most waste, they're food, drinks, and funnily enough, tobacco. So this is done
in the
through
filters.
What was that?
Would it be in the filter, in the packaging of the tobacco?
reckon it's the packaging.
Because the filters have some plastic.
You take off the...
Okay.
For those of you who don't smoke, you buy them in boxes, you unwrap the packaging, you take the plastic off, then you open the box. Then you unwrap the plastic off the box inside the box and open that out. And then there's a piece of... It's just madness.
I have a feeling that it might be in the filters too, and sorry if that upsets you, Fee. But
because there's microplastics everywhere.
I did write a story a long time ago about some fungal enzymes that had been trained to essentially eat
I remember that
the plastic
story.
in cigarette filters, because I think cigarette ends are like the world's most widely littered item.
Oh,
and I think they do contain plastic, I'm afraid. So I'm going to give myself bonus points for quitting smoking recently. So go me.
Well done.
5 gold stars, definitely. That's got to be done. Well, clearly, that's one of those things. If for those of us who need to give up eating meat because a vegan diet is better, and for those of us who need to give up smoking because plastics in the filters is very bad, it becomes very depressing being a person with vices. What can you do?
We all have
But
them.
don't
We
stop.
do all have them. And as you say, it's a systemic problem. So you know what?
Absolutely.
It's up to
Absolutely.
global governments and tobacco companies and all the food and beverage companies. It's up to a lot of people to make a change.
The only thing I would say is people do have to make choices, especially in how they vote, because you're right, it is governments who make decisions and make companies behave differently. But you've got to get governments in power that are prepared to do it. One of the things I love about this analysis they've done is that it actually comes from ordinary people. So over a 5-year period, over 200,000 people all over the world actually submitted data. So, I mean, this is all estimated because it's only 200,000 people doing it. But what it really does show is this incredibly strong relationship between plastic production and pollution. And the only way we're really going to get action on that is to force companies to act. And that may sound like it's anti-free market, but actually all that's happening in a free market is all that cost of pollution, all the people who get sick, the animals that die, the land that gets polluted, that just gets sort of socially paid for by governments and by individuals. So actually, if we're not going to make them pay for the pollution they create, then they need to stop creating it.
I think one important thing to remember here is that also we need government to stop pushing recycling as the solution to all of our plastics problem, because the main problem is the production of it and the use of it. As you said earlier, you buy a little packet of something which is wrapped in plastic, and inside there are more packets wrapped in plastics. And so we need to change the way that we consume many, many products in our daily lives. And, when you were talking about bottles earlier, I was thinking, how many times do you buy a plastic bottles and you see on it, it says, recycle me, as if I'm a company, I'm telling the user to recycle the bottle, and that's my job done. I am very good and I am very sustainable. I this is not how it should be.
I think you both know that this is really one of my passion subjects, but if I was being cynical, I would say that it's not just the governments, it is companies and associations as well. There's a lot of lobbying that goes on in the plastics industry, specifically about chemical recycling, which is this more advanced form of recycling that is supposed to sort of manage some of the types of plastic that have been tougher to recycle in the past, and it's supposed to make them sort of reusable more and more, recyclable more and more times. And more like there has been quite a lot of research that just suggests that is never going to be economically viable, and that it might come with its own consequences, such as the energy consumption, which, carbon emissions. So I really think there's, the plastic crisis is not going to be solved by one simple solution or by one single actor.
Multiple levers.
It's got to be everything that comes together. Having said that, that does lead me quite nicely into my story of the week, which is a start. It's definitely a start. So, as you said, Fee, the latest round of negotiations on the Global Plastic Treaty, I believe, finished today, actually.
Finishes the 29th.
Finishes the day we're recording, anyway. And I think that's the fourth negotiation out of 5 they've got scheduled. They're planning to come out with an agreement by the end of this year, which is quite ambitious, but we'll see how it goes. But anyhow, one country has made a move ahead this week anyway, and that is Canada, where the negotiations were actually held. So Canada has a goal of achieving zero plastic waste by 2030. It's an ambitious goal, but as part of its agenda, it committed to gathering data and setting up a federal plastics registry, which has now been kind of firmed up and has officially come into force. So This federal plastics registry is basically going to require companies to report on the quantity and the type of plastic that is made, imported, or just transacted anywhere in the Canadian market. And producers and service providers will also have to report on the collection of plastic waste, whether it's for diversion, reuse, repair, refurbish, recycled, processed, incinerated, landfilled, whatever happens to this plastic is all going to be recorded on this one federal database. It's going to be sort of a phased introduction. So it's beginning in September 2025 for data gathered in the past year. And in 2026, they're going to add a few more sectors and categories. And then in 2027, they'll add those final categories. But once it's all complete and up and running, it's going to include everyone from resin manufacturers, it's going to include single-use and disposable, it's going to use plastics used in construction, transportation, textiles, electronics, even plastics used in agriculture. So it's really going to be quite a comprehensive database of all the plastic that is used, bought, sold, produced anywhere in Canada, and what happens to that plastic afterwards. And I think this is just a really important step in terms of addressing that problem, because once you know the problem, once you have the evidence, you can come up with evidence-based solutions. And I just think that this is really quite a bold move and it's really quite a dramatic approach. And I just think it's quite an inspirational lead that hopefully other countries can follow suit.
Can I say how much I love that? Just for one very simple reason. One of the things I talk to some of my students about is changing behavior. And one of the most effective changes to the way in which dangerous chemicals were tracked in the US was because they couldn't get legislation about, making companies not transport dangerous chemicals on trains through towns. But they ended up with this agreement that they would just write down and make a record of what companies were doing. And within a very short space of time, because it became really obvious who was moving what where and whether it was dangerous and near, schools and hospitals, they had to change what they were doing because otherwise everybody would have been up in arms. I think it's a brilliant idea.
I think that's quite interesting, actually, because plastic, I feel, perhaps more than almost any other environmental issue I can think of, plastic has really sort of captured the public's attention. It's really, and it's not just for the environmental reasons, it's all the health aspects. Plastic particles have been found in human blood. We've all heard the horror stories. We know it's in our food. We know it's everywhere. It's in the air we breathe.
It's awful.
Yeah, and I think that this is because people can see it, because they're worried for their own personal health, whatever the reason may be, the plastic pollution crisis really seems to just have garnered so much attention, and it's not got the same denialism about it as, global warming or something, when people are like, oh, is it really? Yes, it is, people. I just think that if you have this database, if you combine that with the existing public attention, and there's been plenty of research to show that consumers around the world want to see less plastic. They want more information on what they do with different types of plastic. People want this matter solved. And if you've got that combined with a clear database of who's doing what with their plastic, you get that demand can be channeled towards the right sources, the right people, and they'll be forced to change. You're on mute.
I was like...
One of the things I do think is worth paying attention to is what plastic is being used for, because I think there is a really big difference between the plastic wrapping on the courgette inside the plastic bag of courgettes and PPE, medical grade stuff. And I think, plastic is a wonderful invention that's done many, many amazing things. It's just that, like everything we seem to do as a species. We started using it, no thought of the consequences or how it was made or where it was going to go, and then decided to use it for everything. I remember being at a conference where I listened to a analyst just tell the energy industry not to worry about demand for fossil fuels, because while EVs would increase in number, plastics was going to make up the demand for oil. And you're kind of going,
oh, that's great.
That's not necessarily the direction we want to be going in.
I think that's one thing I really like about this Canadian approach, is just quite how inclusive it is of everything. Because although I say that people are more aware of and maybe care more about plastics than they do about other things, I think the public generally tend to focus on, the plastic bottle that they see floating in their local river or whatever. But I think you've been really clear on this point, Fee, is that it's not just about the plastic waste that we see. It is also about the production, because of that huge demand it places on fossil fuels. And it's also about, the microplastics that we don't always see. I think there is rising awareness of that, but it's still nowhere near the level it needs to be. And I just think that this approach of just making sure that absolutely everything is recorded and made transparent and clear is a really good starting point. And I do think it's important that this has come out in Canada in this week of the negotiations being held in Canada. We are seeing movement on this, and the Global Plastics Treaty, I said earlier that I do think it's quite ambitious that they're going to have an agreement by the end of 2024. In this case, though, I'm not worried about the specific date they come to an agreement, because I think it's really, really important that they take the time and they take the care to do it properly. And if it is done properly, this could be as important as the Paris Agreement.
And I think the other thing to mention is, I think you're right, it's important to take the time to get it right. But what's really important to business is this is happening. This is moving. This is, every country in the world is taking this seriously. And if you don't understand that you need to change the way in which you use plastic in your business, you're going to get left behind. On that chirpy
Definitely.
note, Giulia, what was your story this week?
So my story, which is also from North America, and it's in the US. So also a positive regulation story. The Environmental Protection Agency has made a ruling on coal-fired power plants. So the idea is that they will have to force to capture all of their smokestack emissions or just shut down. So in terms of timelines, for coal plants that want to stay open beyond 2039, they will have to cut or capture 90% of their CO2 emissions by 2032. The plants expect to retire by 2039 will have less stringent requirements. And then the plants that want to retire by 2032 don't have to follow the new rules. So the calculations are that these standards will save the equivalent to the annual emissions of 328 million gas cars by 2047. And so, as we can imagine, this is bringing lots of climate benefits, but also health benefits. And as we said earlier, sometimes the pollution caused by companies, so in this case, the companies that are operating the coal-powered plants, they are paid by us, by the taxpayer, for example, when it comes to health. And so it's very important that we ensure that we have healthy environments for citizens. And in terms of US electricity, looking at how it's mostly produced, coal used to be 45% in 2010, but last year it only provided 16% of the total electricity. So currently the majority of electricity is produced by natural gas, and the remainder is nuclear power or renewables. So, coal power has still been going down over the years, but it's still there and it's still polluting quite a bit. So this is a very important ruling that the Biden administration has brought in. Now we know that there are elections. We don't know who's going to win. So while we can celebrate this positive news, there is always room to overturn it should the next administration want to. So we'll have to wait and see and hope for the best.
I do think movements on coal have been very interesting. That's one word for it anyway. Particularly, I mean, I feel it's more been the back and forth that I was going to comment on, because if you think of this is perhaps more in Europe than in Northern America, but some countries, I'm thinking Poland and Germany, I think, kind of had made movements to end the use of coal. And then the Ukrainian conflict broke out and they kind of backtracked and reverted on those. I also know that the UK has recently approved more coal-fired power plants. But we do have, the COP agreement last year was to phase out the use of fossil fuels. And what was the eventual phrasing they used?
I think it was unabated fossil fuels.
Yeah,
it was unabated,
something like that. But it was transition away. That's what I was going for. Not phase out. We weren't having phase out, but transition away from. So this is going to have to happen, and however slow it may have been, however back and forth it may have been, I actually think this move from the US is really, really positive, especially because although they're saying, yes, you can still operate, but as long as it's captured or cut your emissions. And in industrial carbon capture, so those smokestack emissions, they're not that difficult to capture. It's not like direct air capture when it's a lot more expensive because the carbon in the atmosphere is so diluted. When it's coming from that smokestack, it's actually relatively simple. There's plenty of different technologies. There's plenty of options for this. It's not even just a one-stop shop.
Yeah. I think the thing is, though, it always does boil down to cost, and there's always an energy impact on capturing carbon. But I think maybe we should actually we should have a session on this, on the different technologies and the different costs and why it's so difficult to get agreement on it. But I think the thing we need to do in rounding up is kind of accept that this is actually a really positive step forward. And we should look to see who can actually replicate this, because in the end, the regulation is going to define how far and how fast we can go.
Absolutely.
And on this note, this is all we've got time for in terms of news, but we can move to the interview of the week after a little break. I'm joined today by Yoni Pasternak, Chief Commercial Officer at Nala Earth. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can kick off by explaining what you do at Nala Earth, because I think it's a little bit unusual as a startup. Am I right?
I think I would say you're right that it's unique, but will be increasingly less unique as more and more companies are forced to grapple with nature and biodiversity. So happy to describe what we do. Nala Earth is a nature and biodiversity software platform, and our mission is to bring nature into the boardroom. And the way we do that is we provide companies with the data and tools required for them to understand their interaction with the environment and identify and mitigate nature risk. So we're a team of scientists, engineers, and sustainability experts, and we utilize scientific data sources, including satellite data, primary measurements, and AI models, and we enhance this data to make it actionable for business. And just to make that a little more concrete, the way that companies use our platform is they'll use it to report and comply with new nature regulations. They'll use it to identify and mitigate nature and biodiversity risk. and they'll use it to form nature strategies.
Amazing. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because, you know, everyone talks about going net zero and loads of companies have net zero targets, but it's really a small part of the whole picture. We really need to start talking. Well, there are many people that are starting to talk about going beyond carbon and considering the nature impacts of companies. But at the same time, I feel there isn't enough awareness on this.
I think you're absolutely right. There's nowhere near enough awareness on this topic. And there was a study that came out a few years ago that looked at how frequently media referenced climate change versus biodiversity. And it was actually 8x was the total coverage of climate change relative to biodiversity. And I think it's improved a little bit since then, but that overall pattern is still the same. And so I think that's talking about on the public and media coverage level. If we move towards the way that businesses are thinking about this, we see a similar pattern. So within the Fortune 500, McKinsey released a study that shows that over 80% of the Fortune 500 has a carbon target and a net zero target. But if we look to other dimensions of nature, it's never more than 25%. So 25% of the Fortune 500 has a target on water, 25% has on chemicals and plastics, only 10% on forests, and 5% on biodiversity. And so there really is an enormous gap in terms of the attention and commitment on these topics. That's on the kind of more pessimistic angle. On the positive angle, just over the past 2 years, there is increasingly much more attention being given to this, both in the public and policy domain, as well as in the business domain. On the public and policy side, COP15, which was in Montreal last year, generated a lot of attention for biodiversity. Still not as much as the climate COPs, but there were some really meaningful decisions that emerged from that got decent coverage. And in addition, finally, for the first time, businesses possess standardized guidance on how to conceptualize the interaction with nature due to frameworks like TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and SBTN, Science-Based Targets for Nature, as well as new EU regulations like the EU CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So there are positive signs, but overall, not enough attention.
Yeah, I think it feels like it's moving quite fast, but at the same time, it's probably a bit difficult for companies to catch up. I mean, when we talk about nature impacts, exactly, can you provide some examples of how a company might cause these nature impacts, might affect biodiversity?
Great question. And I think it's helpful here to maybe even zoom out a bit and not only talk about impacts, but also talk about nature dependencies. And so we can start with dependencies, and that would be the way that a business is dependent on nature and the environment. And we can talk about direct dependencies, and these will be ways that a business is dependent on some of the services that nature provides. So to take a few examples, food companies will be highly directly dependent on productive soils, as well as on services like pollination. To take other examples, within the realm of manufacturing facilities will be dependent on the provision of water in order for their operations. That's just on the direct front. If we look at the indirect front, all businesses and society as a whole is dependent on many indirect services that nature provides. For example, regulation of climate and the production of oxygen. So that's on the dependency side. If we then talk about impacts, there are really the Ep12, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They have a framework for talking about 5 different ways that we as a society and business in particular impacts biodiversity. And those 5 categories are: there's direct resource use or exploitation. So for example, the use of fish for a seafood company. There's land use change, freshwater use change, or marine use change. That's actually using land. There's then pollution. The 4th is invasive species, and the 5th is climate change. And so all those categories consist of ways that society as a whole, as well as businesses in particular, can impact the environment. And to take just two recent concrete examples of companies actually impacting the environment or depending on the environment and that causing nature risk, I think that will be helpful to demonstrate that increasingly the business community is understanding that nature risk is really financial risk. And that is a large part of what is stemming more and more attention towards these issues. So let's first look at dependencies. There was recently a high-profile case where Tesla was building a gigafactory in Berlin, but Berlin is an area that has declining groundwater, and they were actually faced lawsuits that prevented them from building a factory there because they would be using too much of Berlin's decreasing groundwater. So that's on the dependency side. If we look at the impact side, in I think it was 2019, there was a really prominent example where PG&E, electric infrastructure company in California, they had sparking transmissions lines that caused wildfires, and they then were sued for a settlement of billions of dollars. So that was the way they impacted the environment that then caused direct financial risk to them. And another prominent example was JBS, a Brazilian meat company, one of the largest in the world. They were identified as having sourced cattle from illegally deforested land and faced some expensive settlements and lawsuits as a result of that.
That's really interesting. And I think that maybe when people read these stories, they don't immediately make the connection of nature and the relationship that companies have with nature. They might just think, oh, Tesla and water, like that's it. And JBS and deforestation. So I just feel that once we put that into the context of nature dependencies and impacts, then we can really understand how this is a much bigger issue than what it seems. And I'm thinking of this figure that circulates around a lot when talking about these issues, that the World Economic Forum calculated that more than half of the global GDP, which is $44 trillion, relies on nature. And once you make that economic link, I think that's when a lot of people are like, oh, well, this is huge. And we're just talking about emissions, which is that small part of the whole picture. And so I think, my next question here is, when a company, when top management realizes what's going on, how can then try to begin their journey towards establishing a strategy around nature?
Yeah, and I think the way that a company can start with this is the first step is understanding the way that their particular business in their particular industry, in the locations that they're in, interfaces with nature. And this will be unique to every single business. So which of nature's services are they directly dependent on, and which do they impact? And you mentioned, climate regulation is just being one of the many services that nature provides. And I think the good news for businesses is that finally, for the first time, there's excellent, really sophisticated, standardized guidance to help a business do this, to understand the way that their business depends and impacts nature. I'll name a few prominent examples to guide listeners. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD is the acronym, they released a really comprehensive set of guidance to help guide businesses and executives in doing exactly this, including with case studies for particular sectors on how to conceptualize and think about these topics. On the tool side, I think there are some very useful free tools that are available that will help businesses do exactly this. Two prominent ones are the Encore tool from UNEP, which tells companies based on the sector that they're in, which of nature's services are they most dependent upon and what are their most likely impacts. And then from WWF, there's also the Biodiversity Risk Filter, which again is a very useful free tool. And if businesses want more sophisticated guidance, there is increasingly more and more service providers like Nala that can help and guide them on that journey. So I think that's the first thing a business should do, understand where the business interacts with nature. I think the second action they can take is determine what currently is going on at their company, what initiatives are there that relate to biodiversity and nature, and also relatedly set particular ambition and objectives for their company in terms of what they want to do with nature. And this reflects the fact that nature and the environment, it's an incredibly large topic, very multifaceted. Often a company will have various initiatives that are going on that touch several components of nature. So this might be, for example, regenerative agriculture programs. It might be nature restoration projects. But for many companies, these are fragmented. So I think one thing is determining where they all are, figuring out how they fit together. And then starting from the board and executives on down, what is their ambition and key objectives in forming a nature strategy? And these can be various, from regulatory compliance to risk mitigation to what are ways that they can build sustainable products and generate value, particularly for the local communities and stakeholders that they interact with. And that can then inform what their objectives are in approaching a nature strategy. So that would be the second piece of advice. And I think finally, the third piece of advice is nature and biodiversity are importantly extremely local. So there's a very important difference from carbon and climate, where the greenhouse gases that you emit into the atmosphere are ambient, whereas the impact that you have on the local environment is very particular to that environment and the species in that environment. And I think a key component for any company to really understand and come to terms with their nature impacts is having supply chain transparency. So particularly, not just direct operations will be easier for a company, but upstream, where are the goods and services and materials that they're sourcing? Where do they come from? And for many companies, that's a very big challenge, but it's a fundamental necessary component of understanding their impact on the environment. And so getting started on trying to achieve supply chain transparency is a key enabler.
Thank you, Yoni. That's such good advice for our listeners. Hopefully they can take some of it on board and start thinking about their nature strategies. Can you provide some examples of best practices of companies that have been doing a good job at this?
Of course. And I think the exciting thing is this is a rapidly evolving space. And so there are increasingly many companies that have really innovative initiatives on nature and biodiversity. And so I will only cite two of those that listeners can go and check out in more detail. One is Kering. So Kering is a luxury and fashion house that owns many well-known luxury brands. And they have had a really fundamental commitment to sustainability for many years now. They created the environmental profit and loss system that some listeners might be familiar with. And on the biodiversity topic, what they've really done is figured out the ways that they can uniquely impact their supply chain and come up with really specific, measurable targets of how they're going to improve the land and the elements of biodiversity that they interact with. And so just to cite one example, they've made a commitment that by 2025, they'll regenerate 1 million hectares of farms and rangelands within their own supply chain. And that's 3 times their total land footprint. So I think there are some elements there that companies can emulate in terms of creating a footprint of their own environmental impact and then compensating for that within their own supply chain. So that's one example. I think a second example of a different flavor is Salesforce. And the reason I like this example is they are using their unique convening power as a technology platform to enable their own customers to take nature positive action. And so they've put together a range of impressive partnerships and tools and services, emulating a lot of what they've done with carbon, so that not only Salesforce themselves as a company within their own direct operations with their employees can be more sustainable, but really equipping their own tens of thousands of customers to have nature positive impact with them. And so I think that's an angle that a lot of companies can take to it, not just in their own direct operations, but what can they as a company uniquely do to the ecosystem?
This is really interesting. And I think if I may add a point on this, Kering and Salesforce are huge companies, but it doesn't mean, and they obviously have a lot of power, a lot of money, resources to invest into these initiatives. But this doesn't mean that the smaller companies can't do anything at all. they might not have the means to immediately create a very holistic strategy around their nature dependencies and impacts. But, they can at least start somewhere, maybe with the water impact or, the deforestation impact.
I think that's exactly right. And maybe this is even a good note to end on, because it's potentially inspiring, is that there's also another key difference here in terms of responses to climate, with responses to biodiversity. And that is that the actions that anyone takes, no matter what scale, on nature and biodiversity, they're often, you can feel them immediately and directly in your local environment, which is very much unlike carbon. So for example, if I do an action that reduces the amount of greenhouse gases that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere, that's great for the environment, but I myself personally in my own environment don't see any immediate consequences. Whereas for biodiversity, it's actually the opposite. So, a really easy example is if I cultivate my own garden or create patches for pollinators or birds, I am immediately able to experience that. And that example follows through to companies too. You mentioned it, even if you have a very small company that doesn't have the resources of the carrying or sales force, they can begin to immediately improve their local environment, whether that means creating habitats for pollinators, whether that means improving water quality, and their own employees, their stakeholders will be able to immediately experience that.
And that's great. That's really positive. We need that. We need that in this time of climate anxiety and so on.
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Yoni, for this amazing chat. It was really enjoyable. We will add links to all the studies that you mentioned in the show notes so people can go and research further. We will add links to Nala Earth and what you guys do. And of course, links to our social media newsletter. And if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And otherwise, see you next week.